The Empathic Echo. By Thomas King. Chapter 2, The First Tremors. The Grand Bazaar of Ethelgard pulsed with a life force that was both exhilarating and, for Zan, profoundly alienating. Sunlight, filtered through intricately woven canopies of vibrant silks and shimmering tapestries, dappled the cobblestone paths, illuminating a kaleidoscope of colors and movement. Every stall was a testament to Ethelgard's unique symbiosis with the ethereal. Vendors hawked self-sharpening knives guided by sharp, inquisitive sprites of intellect. Bakers displayed loaves that rose with the gentle nudge of warm, doughy spirits of nurturing, and jewelers offered amulets that pulsed with the protective luminescence of warding entities. Yet, it was not the manufactured marvels that held Zan's attention, but the living, breathing manifestations that accompanied their human counterparts. He stood near an alcove where a fruit merchant, his face ruddy with good health and his voice a booming tenor, was engaged in a spirited negotiation. Beside him, a sun sprite, a creature of pure golden light and effervescent joy, flitted and danced, mirroring the merchant's jovial mood. Its laughter, a tinkling cascade of chimes, punctuated the merchant's pronouncements, adding an infectious layer of mirth to the exchange. The sprite's very presence seemed to imbue the ripe, glistening fruits with an extra sheen of allure, making them appear more desirable, more delectable. Zan watched, a knot tightening in his chest, as the buyer, a stout woman with a smile as wide as her face, was swayed not just by the merchant's words but by the undeniable charm of his companion. This was the essence of Ethelgard, a dance of human will and emotional resonance, a symphony where every interaction was amplified, enriched, and for Zan, utterly inaccessible. Further down the bustling thoroughfare, a different scene unfolded, one that resonated with a more discordant, yet equally tangible, frequency. An artisan, his brow furrowed in concentration and his hands stained with dark, earthy pigments, was attempting to coax a particularly obstinate vine spirit into submission. This was no benevolent sprite of creativity or diligence. This was a creature of pure annoyance, its thorny tendrils coiling and uncoiling like a restless serpent, its form a muddy, verdant hue tinged with the sharp edges of frustration. The artisan, a man whose normally calm demeanor was being stretched to its breaking point, muttered under his breath, his own frustration a palpable aura that seemed to feed the spirit's defiance. The vine spirit thrashed, its thorns snagging at the artisan's robes, its subtle hisses a low hum of discontent. It was a vivid, almost visceral, depiction of a struggle that was all too common in Ethelgard, the clash between human intent and the capricious nature of one's emotional kin. Zan felt a faint, almost imperceptible echo of the artisan's struggle within himself, a phantom prickle of irritation, but it was an echo devoid of the vibrant, tangible source that fueled the man's very real distress. Zan moved through the throng, his senses on high alert, yet his heart remained a quiet, untroubled void. He was a ghost in this vibrant, emotionally charged landscape, an observer whose own inner world was a silent, unpainted canvas. The sheer intensity of it all was overwhelming. Laughter, so bright and clear from the sun sprite, felt like a physical force, a wave that washed over him and receded, leaving him untouched. The artisan's simmering anger was a heat he could perceive but not feel, a distant ember that held no warmth for him. Even the quiet contentment radiating from a mother gently stroking her child, accompanied by a soft, downy spirit of affection, felt like a language he could see but never speak. He saw a scholar, his face alight with intellectual curiosity, engaged in a hushed conversation with a small, owl-like spirit of wisdom. The creature's wide, intelligent eyes seemed to absorb every word, its feathered head cocked in rapt attention. Its presence lent an air of profound understanding to the scholar's discourse, a tangible weight to abstract concepts. Zan envied the scholar not for the knowledge he possessed, but for the seamless integration of his mind and his companion, a unified front of intellect. His own thoughts, though they could be sharp and analytical, were solitary entities, lacking any ethereal echo, any mirroring affirmation. The sheer variety of manifestations was staggering. He passed a pair of lovers, their hands intertwined, a delicate, rose-hued spirit of tender affection drifting between them, its petals unfurling in time with their soft sighs. Nearby, a street performer juggled glowing orbs, his energetic hoops bright, a shimmering ring of pure kinetic energy, darting and weaving in perfect synchronicity with his movements, its own exhilaration adding an almost intoxicating rhythm to the act. A baker, his face dusted with flour, was being assisted by a plump, doughy spirit of industriousness, its gentle nudges and encouraging murmurs seemingly guiding the baker's hands. Each interaction, each dance between human and spirit, was a testament to the deeply ingrained nature of these bonds in Ethelgard's society. Zan paused by a stall selling enchanted inks and quills. The vendor, a woman with nimble fingers and a discerning eye, was accompanied by a quill sprite, a delicate, feather-light entity that seemed to hum with creative energy. The sprite hovered over the ink pots, its movements precise and elegant, occasionally dipping its own translucent tip into a pot and tracing ephemeral patterns in the air, as if testing the viscosity and hue. The vendor would nod in agreement, her own understanding of her wares amplified by the sprite's silent, intuitive critique. Zen imagined picking up a quill, feeling its balance, its potential. But he knew that even if he could wield it, he would never feel the echo of inspiration from a quill sprite, never share the creative spark. He found himself drawn to the edge of the market, where the stalls grew sparser and the crowds thinned. Here, the manifestations seemed less vibrant, less assured. A lone farmer, his shoulders slumped with worry, sat beside a gaunt, patchy spirit of resilience, its once sturdy form now brittle and thin. The crops they had brought to market, withered and pale, spoke of a struggle far greater than the usual vagaries of weather. Zen felt a flicker of something akin to sympathy, a purely human emotion, unbidden and unconnected to any ethereal resonance. He could recognize suffering, even if he couldn't fully participate in the world's intricate emotional tapestry. He continued his solitary exploration, a detached observer of this vibrant, emotionally resonant world. The air thrummed with 1,000 unspoken feelings, a constant hum of shared joy, frustration, love, and ambition. Each individual, it seemed, was a beacon, their inner life broadcast for all to see, amplified by their spirit companions. A boisterous group of guards, their faces flushed with camaraderie, were accompanied by a sturdy, shield-like spirit of loyalty, its aura a comforting bulwark of shared trust. A solitary street musician, his brow furrowed in concentration, coaxed a melancholic melody from his lute, a wispy, smoke-like spirit of longing trailing behind him, its form mirroring the mournful notes. Zan's own presence was a stark anomaly. He felt like a perfectly silent instrument in an orchestra of resonating voices. He could appreciate the beauty of their song, the intricate harmonies and powerful crescendos, but he could never contribute a single note. The marketplace, a place of commerce and social interaction, was also a grand, public display of emotional interconnectedness, a vibrant, living testament to Ethelgard's unique magic. And in the heart of this pulsating, vibrant world, Zan walked with an unnerving stillness, a creature of quietude in a kingdom defined by its echoes. The sheer density of manifested emotions was a palpable force, a vibrant tide that ebbed and flowed around him, a constant reminder of the fundamental difference that set him apart. He saw a young couple, their faces flushed with the intoxicating bloom of new love, a small, heart-shaped spirit of affection fluttering between them, its rosy glow intensifying with every shared glance. He observed a merchant, his brow furrowed in intense calculation, his companion a sharp, geometric sprite of logic, its every movement a precise, mathematical equation in the air, aiding the haggling. He witnessed a child, her laughter a pure, unadulterated melody, chasing after a playful light sprite, its erratic bursts of luminescence mirroring her boundless glee. These were not mere decorations or accessories. They were extensions of their human partners, tangible manifestations of their inner states. A baker's diligent spirit of creation, a craftsman's focused spirit of precision, a scholar's inquisitive spirit of knowledge, each person's unique emotional landscape was given form, a constant, living dialogue between the corporeal and the ethereal. Zan, however, was a silent observer. He could see the vibrant hues of joy, the stormy grays of anger, the soft blues of melancholy, but they were external phenomena, colors painted on a canvas he could not replicate. He felt the warmth of a sunsprite's glow, but it did not ignite his own spirit. He perceived the sharp edges of a thorny vine of frustration, but they did not prick his own being. It was as if he were watching a grand play, understanding the plot and the emotions of the characters, but utterly incapable of stepping onto the stage himself. The marketplace, with its cacophony of sounds and its vibrant visual tapestry, was a sensory overload for any outsider, but for Zan, it was a constant, subtle testament to his fundamental otherness. He navigated through the throng, his senses keenly attuned to the ebb and flow of ambient emotions, a skill honed by necessity. He could distinguish the anxious flutter of a vendor anticipating a slow day from the jubilant burst of a successful sale, the quiet contentment of a satisfied customer from the simmering frustration of a poorly made item. Yet, he experienced none of it as his own. The jumble of feelings, so potent and pervasive for everyone else, simply washed over him, leaving no residue, no echo. He saw a blacksmith, his muscles rippling with exertion, a sturdy, anvil-shaped spirit of resilience hovering protectively over him, its form radiating a steady, unyielding strength. The blacksmith's effort was amplified, his physical labor imbued with an almost mythical endurance. Zan, in contrast, felt no such augmentation, no external validation of his own efforts. He observed a storyteller, his voice weaving a captivating narrative, and beside him, a vibrant, theatrical spirit of performance, its gestures grand and its colors shifting with the mood of the tale. The audience, enraptured, not only absorbed the words but the palpable energy of the performance, the shared emotional journey facilitated by the spirit. Zan, standing at the periphery, felt the distant pull of the story, but the true magic, the shared immersion, remained just beyond his reach. The very air of Ethelgard seemed to thrum with these interconnected energies, a constant symphony of feeling that made the kingdom so unique, so vibrant, and for Zan, so isolating. He felt a pang, not of sadness, but of a profound, intellectual curiosity. How did it feel, he wondered, to have a part of oneself made manifest, to have one's inner world reflected in such vivid, tangible form? It was a question that had no answer within him, a void where a connection should have been. He continued to walk, a solitary island in a sea of resonating souls, the bustling marketplace a constant, vibrant reminder of the world he could observe but never truly join. The heart of Ethelgard, the Grand Bazaar, throbbed with a rhythm that was usually a balm to Zan's soul, a familiar cacophony that masked his internal silence. But today, the usual ebb and flow of bartering, laughter, and the gentle hum of ambient spirits felt off. A prickle of unease, alien and sharp, crawled beneath his skin. It began subtly, a discordant note in the otherwise harmonious symphony of the market. The air, usually alive with the scent of exotic spices and blooming spirit herbs, now carried a faint, metallic tang, like the breath of a storm gathering on the horizon. He was weaving through a particularly dense cluster of stalls, where luminous fungi pulsed with soft light and vendors hawked charms woven from starlight, when the first tremor truly hit. It wasn't a physical shaking of the ground, but a tremor in the very fabric of the market's vibrant energy. The joyful dance of a nearby sunsprite faltered, its golden light flickering like a dying candle. A baker's doughy spirit of nurturing whimpered, shrinking back towards its human counterpart. The ambient hum of interconnectedness, normally a constant, comforting presence, became a ragged, uneven pulse. Zan stopped, his senses on high alert. He felt it too, not as a shared emotion, but as a disruption in the patterns he had grown so adept at observing. It was like watching a perfectly orchestrated dance suddenly devolve into a chaotic scramble. A wave of unease rippled through the crowd. People paused in their transactions, their faces etched with a shared, unspoken apprehension. Even the normally stoic city guards, their loyalty sprites a solid, comforting presence beside them, shifted their weight, their hands instinctively moving towards their sword hilts. Then the screams began. A runaway cart, its heavy wooden frame groaning under an unseen burden, burst through a perpendicular aisle, shattering the semblance of order. It careened wildly, its iron-shod wheels tearing gouges in the ancient cobblestones. The vendors nearest to its path scattered, their stalls overturned in a chaotic cascade of goods. Shouts of alarm turned to shrieks of terror as the cart's trajectory became terrifyingly clear. It was heading directly towards a small knot of children who had been mesmerized by a street performer's dazzling display of illusionary fire. Panic, raw and primal, erupted. The air, already thick with unease, now crackled with a tangible wave of fear. It was a storm of emotion, a torrent that swept through the marketplace, and for the first time in his life, Zan felt its full, crushing force. He had always been an observer of emotion, a detached witness to the vibrant tapestry of Ethelgard's collective psyche. He could see the colors, understand the patterns, but never truly feel them. But this was different. As the cart bore down on the oblivious children, a visceral, overwhelming terror seized Zan. It wasn't his own fear, not entirely, but an echo so potent, so undeniable, that it felt like a physical blow. His breath hitched in his throat. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. He saw the wide, innocent eyes of the children, the horrifying speed of the cart, the helpless, frozen faces of the adults nearby. The sheer, unadulterated horror of the moment bypassed his usual defenses, his carefully constructed detachment, and plunged straight into his core. He squeezed his eyes shut, a desperate attempt to shut out the scene, to retreat into his customary inner stillness. No, 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 he thought, a frantic internal plea. He couldn't feel. But the terror was a tidal wave, threatening to drown him. He fought against it, a silent, desperate battle within himself. He focused on the stillness, on the void that was his own being. He willed himself to be empty, to be nothing, to be the unbreachable wall he had always been. And then, something happened. It was infinitesimally small, a ripple in the raging storm of panic. The runaway cart, its momentum seemingly unstoppable, lurched. It didn't stop completely, not by any stretch of the imagination, but for a fraction of a second, its forward rush stuttered. The grinding of its wheels seemed to falter, the violent rattling of its frame momentarily subdued. It was as if an unseen hand had briefly, almost imperceptibly, tightened its grip on the runaway vehicle. Then, as quickly as it had faltered, the cart resumed its terrifying charge, its momentum seemingly reasserted, the brief hesitation swallowed by the sheer force of its uncontrolled descent. The children, startled by the momentary lull, scrambled back, their screams now laced with confusion, just as the cart thundered past the spot where they had stood. The illusionist, his face a mask of horror, was already pulling them to safety, his own nimble spirit of dexterity a blur of motion. The incident, in its terrifying entirety, lasted perhaps 10 heartbeats. The cart continued its chaotic rampage down a side street, eventually crashing into a stack of crates and coming to a jarring halt, its driver thrown clear and likely injured. The immediate danger to the children had passed, but the marketplace was still awash in the aftershocks of fear and adrenaline. People were helping each other up, checking for injuries, their faces pale and shaken. The usual vibrant sounds of the bazaar were replaced by gasps, sobs, and the urgent, comforting murmurs of those trying to restore order. Amidst the chaos, Zan stood frozen, his eyes still squeezed shut. The terror that had gripped him had receded, but it had left behind a chilling residue. That momentary stutter of the cart, it had been him. He felt it, a faint, phantom sensation like the lingering warmth of a touch. A tiny, almost undetectable surge of his own dormant power, an involuntary eruption born of sheer, unadulterated terror. He hadn't willed it, hadn't even been aware of it until it had happened. It was a flicker, a fleeting spark, but it was undeniable. A cold dread washed over him, far more profound than the fear he had momentarily experienced. He had always prided himself on his control, on his absolute neutrality. He was a void, an observer, incapable of impacting the world through any means other than his conscious will, and even that was limited. But this was different. This was an uncontrolled reaction, a leakage of something he had kept buried deep within him for as long as he could remember. He slowly opened his eyes, his gaze sweeping over the still panicked crowd. No one had noticed. How could they have? They were consumed by their own terror, by the immediate threat. A cart crashing was a common enough occurrence, unfortunately. A brief, almost imperceptible hesitation in its trajectory? Lost in the blur of panic and adrenaline. But Zan knew. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't as detached as he believed. He wasn't as inert as he had always thought. There was something within him, something he had actively suppressed, something that could, under extreme duress, manifest itself. This latent power, this hidden reservoir, had reacted instinctively to the overwhelming surge of fear around him, to the imminent danger he had perceived. He felt a tremor run through him, a shiver that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. It was the tremor of a fundamental truth being revealed, a truth that shattered his carefully constructed reality. He had always believed himself to be a blank slate, an empty vessel. But now he knew there was something inside, something that had the potential to interact with the world, even if it was in a way he couldn't control. The thought was both terrifying and strangely exhilarating. For years he had been a prisoner of his own emptiness, an outsider looking in. The inability to connect, to participate, had been a constant ache. Now there was a hint of something more, a possibility of influence, of impact. But the uncontrolled nature of it, the involuntary outburst, was deeply unsettling. It was a wild, untamed force, and he had no idea how to harness it, or even if he wanted to. He needed to get away, to retreat to a place where he could think, where he could process this unsettling revelation. The Grand Bazaar, with its constant barrage of emotional energy, was no longer a sanctuary. It was now a reminder of his own hidden depths, a stage upon which a previously unknown aspect of himself had just made a fleeting, terrifying debut. He turned, his movements stiff, and began to move away from the epicenter of the commotion. He kept his head down, his gaze fixed on the cobblestones, acutely aware of the lingering fear that still clung to the air like smoke. Each jostle from a passerby felt like a poke, a prod, a reminder of his altered state. He could feel the faint echo of the cart's near-fatal impact in his own limbs, a phantom resonance that unnerved him. He had always observed the interactions between humans and their spirits, the tangible expressions of emotion that defined Ethelgard. He had seen anger manifest as thorny vines, joy as effervescent sprites, love as soft, glowing orbs. He had understood these phenomena intellectually, categorizing them, analyzing them. But he had never experienced a similar manifestation from himself. He had no spirit companion, no outward expression of his inner world. He was, as he had always believed, a void. But that brief, involuntary surge of power, it had been an expression, hadn't it? A raw, unfiltered output of his internal state. Terror, extreme terror, had somehow translated into a physical, albeit subtle, force. It was a deviation from the norm, a crack in the foundation of his carefully maintained existence. He recalled the precise sensation, a tightening in his chest, a surge of something hot and cold at once, a desperate clenching of his will against an overwhelming external force. And then, that strange, almost electric hum that had momentarily resonated through him, a hum that seemed to have reached out and touched the world. He reached the quieter outskirts of the bazaar, where the stalls were fewer and the crowds thinner. The sounds of distress were more muted here, replaced by a more subdued current of anxiety and relief. He found a deserted alcove, shaded by an ancient, gnarled tree whose leaves seemed to whisper secrets of the earth. He sank onto a low stone bench, his body heavy with a weariness that went beyond physical exertion. He closed his eyes again, not in an attempt to suppress, but to focus. He tried to recall the exact feeling of that surge. He concentrated, digging deep within himself, searching for any residual trace of that energy. He felt the familiar emptiness, the vast expanse of his inner void, but now, it felt different. It was no longer just an absence, it was a space that had been briefly, unexpectedly occupied. He imagined the cart, its wheels spinning, its mass hurtling forward. He conjured the image of the children, their small forms directly in its path. He allowed himself to almost feel the terror, not to be consumed by it, but to understand its power, to see if he could recreate the conditions that had led to the outburst. He held his breath, focusing all his will, all his concentration, on that single point of imminent danger. He felt a faint tremor in his hands, a subtle tension in his jaw. He pushed, mentally, willing some unseen force to interact with his imagination, to manifest. But nothing happened. The void remained a void. The stillness was absolute. Frustration, a familiar companion, began to surface. Was he imagining it? Had he simply misinterpreted a natural tremor, a coincidence amplified by his own heightened state of panic? It was possible. Ethelgard was a city of wonders, and strange occurrences were not uncommon. Perhaps the cart had simply hit a particularly uneven patch of cobblestone, or perhaps its precarious load had shifted, causing a momentary imbalance. Yet the feeling lingered. The sensation of a subtle, almost ethereal hum resonating within him, a whisper of power that had momentarily touched the physical world. It was too specific, too vivid to be dismissed as mere imagination. He had always been keenly aware of his own internal landscape, his own stillness. He would have noticed such a tremor, such an internal vibration. He opened his eyes and looked at his hands. They were steady, unmarked, devoid of any outward sign of the power that might reside within him. He flexed his fingers, feeling the familiar sensation of bone and muscle, but nothing more. There was no glow, no shimmer, no tangible evidence of any anomaly. He stood up, a knot of uncertainty tightening in his stomach. He had always been defined by what he wasn't. He wasn't like the others, with their spirit companions and their resonant emotions. He was an anomaly, a silent observer in a world of amplified feelings. But today, that carefully constructed identity had been challenged. He might still be a void, but perhaps it was a void with a hidden, volatile core. He needed to understand this. He needed to know what had happened, and more importantly, if it could happen again. The thought of such uncontrolled power within him was deeply unsettling, a potential threat to the quiet existence he had meticulously cultivated. But the alternative, the possibility that he could, inadvertently, interact with the world in ways he couldn't comprehend, was even more disturbing. He walked away from the bench, his mind racing. The Grand Bazaar, once a place of familiar, albeit alienating, comfort, now felt like a place of heightened scrutiny. He was no longer just an observer of others' emotional outbursts. He was now a potential source of his own. The first tremors had indeed begun, not in the earth, but within him, shaking the very foundations of his being. The quietude he had always known was now threatened by a nascent power he neither understood nor controlled, a power born from a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. He was a mystery, even to himself, and the cart incident had just brought that mystery into sharper, more alarming focus. He had to be careful. More careful than he had ever been. For the first time, Zen felt a genuine, personal fear of the unknown that resided within his own silent self. The world of Ethelgard, with its visible manifestations of emotion, suddenly felt a lot more complicated, a lot more dangerous. And he, Zen, the man who felt nothing, had just experienced an involuntary outburst of something powerful, something that had momentarily disrupted the very fabric of reality. The implications were staggering, and he had no idea where they would lead. The air in the Grand Bazaar, once thick with the scent of spices and the hum of commerce, now carried a residue of lingering fear, a palpable tension that clung to the cobblestones and the scattered debris of overturned stalls. Zen, his senses still reeling from the involuntary surge of power, moved through the thinning crowds like a phantom, his mind a tempest of disbelief and burgeoning dread. He had always known himself to be an island of stillness in the vibrant, emotional ocean of Ethelgard, an observer incapable of disturbing the currents. But the runaway cart, the terrified children, the impossible, infinitesimal pause in its terrifying descent, it had shattered that carefully constructed reality. He found himself on the periphery of the market's chaos, drawn to a quieter corner where the shadows of towering buildings offered a semblance of privacy. His heart still thrummed with a frantic rhythm, a drumbeat against the stillness he usually cherished. He replayed the moment endlessly, the primal terror, the desperate clenching of his will, and then, the almost imperceptible shudder of the cart. It had been him. The certainty was a cold, sharp thing, piercing the fog of his confusion. He, Zan, the silent orphan, the one who felt nothing, had acted. He sank onto a worn stone bench, the rough texture a grounding sensation against his trembling hands. He looked at his palms, flexing his fingers, searching for any outward sign of the anomaly. Nothing. They were the same hands that had always been empty, devoid of spirit companions or outward manifestations of inner life. Yet he knew. He felt it, a faint, almost imperceptible echo within him, like the fading warmth of a touch that had never been made. It was a power he hadn't sought, hadn't understood, and certainly hadn't controlled. As he wrestled with this bewildering revelation, a subtle shift in the ambient energy caught his attention. It was a different kind of tremor, not of fear or panic, but of keen observation. He felt a focused, analytical gaze upon him, a silent scrutiny that pricked at his skin. He instinctively looked up, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the remaining market-goers, the weary guards, the hurried merchants. Then he saw her. Standing a dozen paces away, near the remnants of a spice stall that had been flattened by the runaway cart, was a woman unlike any he had encountered in the boisterous chaos of the bazaar. She was clad in the practical, dark leather of the royal guard, her posture rigid with authority, her eyes sharp and intelligent, scanning the scene with an efficiency that bespoke years of training. Her presence exuded a quiet, potent strength, a discipline that seemed to cut through the lingering disarray. But it was not her uniform or her bearing that drew Zan's attention. It was the ethereal companion that hovered beside her, a spectral manifestation of her spirit. It was an owl, its form woven from swirling, opalescent mist, its wings held in a perpetual state of silent readiness. Its eyes, twin points of glowing emerald, seemed to pierce the very air, and Zan had the unnerving sensation that they were fixed upon him. The owl's gaze was not one of accusation or alarm, but of deep, analytical curiosity. It was a look that dissected, that catalogued, that sought to understand. And in that moment, Zan felt an unsettling kinship with the mist-formed creature. It was a spirit of watchfulness, of perception, and it seemed to be registering something unusual, something aberrant. The woman, Elara, if the discreet insignia on her shoulder was any indication, moved with a deliberate grace. She approached the area where the cart had veered wildly, her expression unreadable. Her owl spirit, its misty wings rustling almost silently, mirrored her movements, its keen eyes continuing their sweeping examination of the surroundings. Zan, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach, watched her intently. He had always observed the spirits of others, marveling at their diverse forms and expressions. He knew the fierce loyalty of a warhound, the playful mischief of a sprite, the nurturing warmth of a hearth spirit. But Elara's owl felt different. It radiated an almost unnerving level of awareness, a quiet intensity that seemed to absorb every detail. As Elara stooped to examine a deep gouge in the cobblestones, her owl spirit drifted closer to Zan's position, its emerald eyes seemingly unfocused, yet Zan felt a distinct sensation of being seen. It wasn't the casual glance of a passerby, it was a deliberate, probing assessment. He instinctively tensed, his desire to retreat warring with the compulsion to observe. He was an observer, yes, but he was also a secret, and the owl's unwavering gaze felt like a threat to that carefully guarded secrecy. He recalled the moment the cart had faltered, the impossible stutter in its trajectory. He had felt it within himself, a nascent power surging outwards. Had that surge been perceptible? Had it left any trace, any ripple in the tangible world that a keen observer, and their perceptive spirit, could detect? He had dismissed it as too subtle, too fleeting to be noticed. But Elara and her owl were not just any observers. They were the embodiment of Ethelgard's protective vigilance. He felt a strange pull, a silent conversation between himself and the owl spirit. It was not a communication of words or emotions, but a resonance of energy. He felt the owl's keen perception, its ability to discern patterns and anomalies, and in response, he felt a subtle, defensive hardening within himself, a reinforcement of the void he had always cultivated. He did not want his secret exposed. Not now, not ever. Elara straightened, a faint frown creasing her brow as she ran a gloved hand along the uneven cobblestones. She then looked up, her gaze sweeping over the immediate area. For a fleeting moment, her eyes met Zan's. There was no recognition, no overt suspicion, but there was an assessment. A flicker of her own innate perception, perhaps sensing the residual turmoil within him, or perhaps simply noting his stillness amidst the receding chaos. The owl spirit, too, seemed to pause, its head cocking slightly as if it had heard a sound only it could perceive. It then turned its mist-wrought gaze back towards the path the cart had taken, its emerald eyes scanning the air as if looking for something invisible. Zan held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. He tried to project an aura of perfect normalcy, of detached observation, the role he had perfected over years of life in Ethelgard. He focused on the image of himself as a blank canvas, an empty vessel, the man who felt nothing. Elara moved on, her owl spirit gliding silently beside her. She spoke briefly to a nearby guard, her voice low and professional, her attention now shifting to the overall assessment of the damage and potential causes of the incident. Zan watched them go, the intense scrutiny of the owl spirit slowly receding, replaced by the general hum of the market's slow return to normalcy. but the encounter had left him unsettled. He had been observed, not just as a bystander, but as something potentially significant. The owl's keen senses had detected something, a subtle dissonance in the otherwise chaotic symphony of the market. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had not been imagining the incident. The tremor, the brief pause, the almost imperceptible shift in momentum, it had been him. And it was possible, terrifyingly possible, that someone else, someone with the refined senses of a trained observer and a spirit companion attuned to the subtlest energies, had caught a fleeting glimpse of that anomaly. He had always considered himself invisible, a wraith in the vibrant tapestry of Ethelgard. His lack of emotional resonance, his inability to connect with the spirits that imbued the city with its unique character, had rendered him an outsider, a ghost in the machine. But the incident with the cart had revealed a hidden potential within him, a latent power that could, however inadvertently, interact with the physical world. And now, that hidden potential had attracted the attention of the city's vigilant protectors. He stood up from the bench, his movements stiff. He needed to leave the bazaar, to find a place of solitude where he could grapple with this unsettling new reality. The incident had been a tremor, a warning. But Alara and her owl represented a new kind of tremor, a focused observation that threatened to unearth the very secret he had spent his life concealing. He was no longer just afraid of his own unknown power, he was now afraid of being discovered. He began to walk away, his gaze fixed on the ground, trying to blend back into the stream of people. He could still feel the phantom sensation of the owl's gaze, a lingering prickle on his skin. It was a reminder that his invisibility was an illusion, and that in a city where spirits and emotions were tangible forces, even the most profound stillness could cast a shadow. He had always believed himself to be a blank slate, but the guardian's gaze had suggested otherwise. Perhaps, he thought with a sinking heart, his blankness was merely a carefully constructed facade, and beneath it lay something that could, and would, eventually be seen. The first tremors had not only shaken the bazaar, but they had also revealed him, a silent observer now under the watchful eye of Ethelgard's most perceptive guardian. The path ahead, once a predictable expanse of solitude, now seemed fraught with unseen dangers, with the constant threat of exposure. He had to understand what he was, and he had to do it before anyone else, especially someone with emerald eyes that could pierce the mist, discovered his secret. The very nature of his existence, once a matter of quiet certainty, had become a terrifying question mark, and the answer, he suspected, lay hidden within the depths of his own, once silent, self. The guardian's gaze had not just observed the aftermath of a runaway cart, it had perceived the subtle ripple of a power that should not exist, a power that originated from the most unlikely of sources. And that perception was the beginning of a new, far more dangerous chapter in Zan's life. He could feel it, a subtle shift in the air, a tension that spoke of scrutiny and a growing awareness of his presence. The guardian's keen senses, amplified by her owl spirit, had registered an anomaly, a flicker of something out of place in the chaotic tapestry of the market. It was a disquieting thought, for Zan had always prided himself on his ability to remain unseen, to exist on the fringes of perception. But the incident with the cart had changed things. It had revealed a part of himself that was raw, untamed, and most alarmingly, capable of influencing the world around him. He quickened his pace, the thought of that mist-wrought owl with its emerald eyes a persistent shadow at his heels. He had always viewed Ethelgard's citizens and their spirits as fascinating, alien phenomena, vibrant expressions of life that he could observe but never participate in. But Alara and her owl represented a different kind of interaction, a direct, professional assessment of the unusual. They were the eyes of the city, the guardians of its order, and they had, however briefly, focused on him. He found himself glancing back, half expecting to see the owl hovering, its gaze fixed upon him. But the street was filled with the ordinary bustle of recovery, people tending to their stalls, guards directing traffic, the air still thick with the scent of spilled spices and dust. Alara and her owl were no longer visible. Yet the impression of their scrutiny remained, a tangible weight on his consciousness. He had always believed that his lack of outward spirit, his profound inner stillness, made him immune to such observation. He was a void, an absence, and absences were, by their very nature, overlooked. But the subtle distortion, the temporal stutter he had inadvertently created, had been something. It had been a disturbance, a disruption of the natural order, and such things, he now understood, did not go unnoticed by those tasked with maintaining that order. He turned a corner, seeking the anonymity of a narrower alleyway, the noise of the main thoroughfare fading behind him. He hugged the shadows, his senses still on high alert, not for physical threats, but for the subtle energies that might betray his presence. He imagined the owl, its mist form swirling, its emerald eyes scanning the very air for traces of the anomaly. Had it seen a flicker of displaced energy? A faint shimmer where nothing should have been? Or had it simply registered a momentary disruption in the flow of time itself, a ripple that indicated an unnatural intervention? He didn't know, and the not knowing was a gnawing anxiety. His carefully cultivated detachment was eroding, replaced by a burgeoning fear that was, ironically, a very familiar human emotion. He had spent his life observing fear in others, cataloging its manifestations. Now, he was experiencing it himself, a cold, creeping dread born not of external threats, but of an internal revelation. The incident with the cart had been a shock, a terrifying glimpse into a potential he never knew he possessed. But Alara's watchful gaze and the silent, perceptive presence of her owl represented a new kind of danger, the danger of discovery. He was no longer just a mystery to himself, he was becoming a mystery to others, and in Ethelgard, mysteries were rarely left unexamined. He paused for a moment, leaning against the cool stone of a building, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had always sought stillness, a refuge from the overwhelming emotional currents of the city. But now, his own internal stillness felt like a dangerous secret, a potential source of disruption. He was a paradox, a man who felt nothing, yet had inadvertently caused an effect. A man who sought to remain unseen, yet had drawn the attention of the city's keenest observers. The Guardian's gaze had seen more than just a frightened orphan in the aftermath of a disaster. It had seen a hint of something extraordinary, something that defied the ordinary workings of their world. And Zan, the observer, the man of no emotion, was now the observed, and the implications were as vast and terrifying as the void within himself. He had to find a way to understand this power, to control it, before it consumed him, or worse, before it brought the full force of Ethelgard's guardians down upon him. The first tremors had indeed begun, and they were far from over. They had merely shifted their focus, from the chaotic marketplace to the silent, solitary figure at its edge. The clamor of the Grand Bazaar, a symphony of shouts, haggling, and the occasional joyous cry, faded into a dull roar as Zan navigated the labyrinthine alleys. Each step was a deliberate act of suppression, a conscious effort to push down the exhilarating terror that still thrummed beneath his skin. The image of the runaway cart, its desperate lurch halted by an unseen force, replayed endlessly behind his eyes. It was him. The certainty was a brand, seared into his consciousness, a stark refutation of everything he believed himself to be. He, Zan, the orphan who felt nothing, had acted. The stillness he had always cherished, the quietude that defined his existence, had been shattered by a force he didn't understand, a power he hadn't sought, and certainly hadn't controlled. He found himself on the edge of the city, where the polished stones of the marketplace gave way to the rougher, dust-choked paths leading to the poorer districts. His meager dwelling, a cramped room above a cobbler's shop, offered no comfort, only the sterile promise of solitude. As he fumbled with the worn wooden latch, his hands trembled, not from cold, but from a profound internal tremor that echoed the fleeting hesitation of the cart. The latch clicked open, and he slipped inside, closing the door with a soft thud that seemed to seal him off from the world, and more importantly, from himself. The single window, grimy and streaked with rain, offered a sliver of the fading twilight. It illuminated motes of dust dancing in the air, a silent testament to the room's neglect. Zan sank onto the edge of his straw-filled mattress, the rough texture a familiar, yet now jarring, sensation. He stared at his hands, flexing his fingers, searching for any outward sign of the anomaly, any visible manifestation of the power that had coursed through him. There was nothing. They were the same hands that had always been empty, devoid of any spirit companion, any outward expression of inner life. He was a void, an absence, a canvas upon which the vibrant spirits of Ethelgard painted their emotions, their passions, their very beings. but the incident in the bazaar had revealed that his void was not empty. It was a reservoir, a hidden wellspring of something potent, something dangerous. The uncontrolled surge of power was a terrifying prospect. He had always prided himself on his detachment, his ability to observe the world without being truly a part of it. He felt no joy, no sorrow, no anger, only a dull, persistent emptiness. This emptiness had been his shield, his sanctuary. It had allowed him to navigate the complex, emotionally charged society of Ethelgard without being swept away by its currents. But now, this emptiness had proven to be a deceptive facade. Beneath the surface of his placid indifference lay a power that could manifest, that could interact with the tangible world, that could, in a moment of desperate instinct, alter the course of fate. He closed his eyes, trying to conjure the sensation. It wasn't a physical feeling, not a warmth or a coldness, but a subtle, internal shift, like a taut string vibrating with an inaudible frequency. It had been a desperate plea, an unconscious reaching out, and the world had responded. The sheer impossibility of it gnawed at him. How could he, a man who struggled to feel the simple ache of hunger or the sting of a bruise, possess such a force? His mind, already a landscape of fragmented memories and unanswered questions, now churned with a new and profound uncertainty. His past was a blank slate. He remembered nothing before his arrival at the orphanage, nothing of parents, of a childhood, of a home. He was a phantom, a ghost in his own life, pieced together from the discarded fragments of Ethelgard's memory. This lack of a past had always been a source of quiet shame, a silent accusation of his inherent otherness. But now, this void in his history felt like a fertile ground for even greater fear. What was he? Where did this power come from? Was it an inherent part of him, something he had always possessed but never known, or was it a curse, a malignant growth that had festered in the darkness of his forgotten past? He recoiled from the thought that this ability might be a gift, a blessing in disguise. It felt like a violation, a corruption of his carefully constructed self. The incident had not brought him closer to belonging, it had driven him further into the abyss of his isolation. He imagined the meticulous analysis of the royal guard, the quiet scrutiny of Alara and her mist-wrought owl. They were the guardians of Ethelgard, the arbiters of its order, and they had, however fleetingly, perceived an anomaly, him. The thought sent a fresh wave of dread through him. His very existence, his hidden nature, had been momentarily illuminated by the keen gaze of those who sought to understand and control the extraordinary. The fear of discovery was a primal, visceral thing. It was the fear of being dissected, of being catalogued, of being deemed a threat. He had spent his life as a shadow, a whisper in the city's grand narrative. His desire for normalcy, for a quiet existence, was not a wish for connection, but a desperate longing to remain unseen, unheard, unfelt. This new power, this ability to interact with the world, was a direct contradiction to that desire. It was a beacon, a siren call that would inevitably draw unwanted attention. He ran a hand over his face, the rough stubble a familiar anchor. He could not afford to be discovered. The consequences were too dire, the implications too vast. He imagined himself being studied, probed, his very essence laid bare for the world to scrutinize. The thought was anathema to him. His inner world, even in its emptiness, was his own. It was the last bastion of his identity, and he would defend it with every fiber of his being. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. The stars, distant and indifferent, were beginning to prick through the velvety blackness. They were a constant, a reminder of a universe far larger and more complex than the bustling city below. He felt a kinship with their cold, silent brilliance. They, too, existed in their own space, their own time, their own immutable laws. He would emulate them, becoming a distant, silent force, observable but never truly understood. His lack of emotions had always been a shield, but now it felt like a weakness. If he could not feel, how could he understand the nuances of this power? How could he learn to control it, to harness it, without the innate understanding that came with emotional resonance? He was a blind man navigating a world of vibrant colors, a deaf man trying to decipher a symphony. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how ill-equipped he was for this new reality. His isolation, once a chosen state of being, now felt like a profound handicap. He needed to understand. Not for the sake of belonging, not for the sake of connection, but for the sake of survival. He had to find a way to control this power, to bury it deeper than ever before, to ensure that it would never again ripple to the surface and draw the attention of those who would seek to exploit or eradicate it. The thought of Ilara's owl, its emerald eyes piercing the veil of his practiced stillness, sent a shiver down his spine. He had been seen, and that perception was a threat he could not afford to ignore. He walked to the small, worn table in the center of the room and picked up a piece of charcoal. He needed to document, to record, to try and make sense of the incomprehensible. His lack of memory meant that his past was a mystery, but his future, he now realized, was a far more terrifying one. He dipped the charcoal in a small pot of water, its edges softening, and began to sketch. Not images of his past, for there were none, but diagrams, symbols, attempts to capture the elusive essence of the power that had awakened within him. He drew swirling patterns, lines that intersected and diverged, trying to represent the internal tremor, the surge, the subsequent stillness. He worked through the night, the charcoal scratching against the rough parchment, the only sound in the oppressive silence. His mind, usually a placid lake, was now a churning sea, disturbed by the tempest of his newfound abilities and the gnawing fear of their discovery. He drew and redrew, erasing and refining, trying to find a language that could articulate the inarticulable. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was just the beginning. The incident in the bazaar was a mere tremor, a prelude to something far greater, something that would test the limits of his carefully constructed existence. He would not be a victim of his own power. He would not be a pawn in the games of those who sought to control the extraordinary. He was Zan, the orphan, the observer, the man who felt nothing. And he would continue to be so, at all costs. His isolation would become his fortress, his stillness his weapon. He would become a master of his own void, ensuring that the seeds of doubt, once sown, would never be allowed to sprout into the full bloom of revelation. The night was long, and the journey ahead was fraught with peril, but Zan was determined to walk it alone, a silent sentinel guarding a secret that could shatter the very foundations of Ethelgard. The fear was a potent motivator, and it fueled his resolve to disappear, to become even more of a ghost than he had ever been, to ensure that the eyes that had glimpsed his anomaly would find nothing but an empty, unchanging stillness. He would not be defined by this power. He would contain it, control it, and ultimately, render it invisible. The city's vigilant gaze, sharp and perceptive, would search in vain for a trace of the anomaly it had briefly detected, for Zan would ensure that the anomaly would cease to exist, or at least cease to be perceivable by any outward means. His own self-knowledge was a dangerous thing, and he would actively work to erase it, to become a true blank slate, incapable of revealing the extraordinary that lay dormant within. The very thought of being understood, of being known, was a terrifying prospect, and he would dedicate himself to ensuring that it never happened. His retreat into his meager dwelling was not an act of defeat, but a strategic maneuver, a preparation for a battle he intended to fight in the deepest, most silent trenches of his own being. The first tremors had indeed shaken him, but they had also forged a new resolve, a chilling determination to remain forever in the shadows, an enigma even to himself. He would become a master of his own non-existence, a phantom of profound stillness, a living paradox that defied perception. This was his new path, forged in the crucible of fear and illuminated by the chilling certainty that his true nature was a secret that must never be revealed, not to Ethelgard, and not even to himself. He would become the ultimate void, a testament to the power of unfeeling observation, a living embodiment of the unseen. The charcoal lay discarded, the parchment filled with his desperate attempts to map the unmappable. The true mapping, he knew, would have to take place within the silent, uncharted territories of his own being. And that was a journey he would undertake in absolute solitude, leaving no trace, casting no shadow that could be interpreted. He would be the absence that was so profound, so complete, that it would confound even the keenest of eyes, even the most perceptive of spirits. The promise of anonymity was his only solace, and he would cling to it with the tenacity of a drowning man. The air within the oracle's sanctum was thick with the scent of ancient incense and ozone, a palpable reminder of the potent energies that swirled around the chamber. Starlight, not from any visible celestial body, but seemingly woven from the very fabric of existence, pulsed within the deep-set eyes of Lysandra, the oracle of Ethelgard. Her form, draped in robes the color of a twilight sky, seemed to shimmer, as if she were more spirit than flesh, a conduit through which cosmic currents flowed. For centuries she had served as Ethelgard's conduit to the whispers of fate, her pronouncements often veiled in metaphor, yet invariably prescient. Tonight, however, the whispers had escalated into a roar, a symphony of discord that threatened to drown out the delicate harmonies of the present. Lysandra's eyes, typically pools of serene wisdom, were now wide with a disquiet that bordered on terror. Her gnarled hands, usually steady as they traced celestial patterns in the air, trembled uncontrollably. The starlight within her seemed to fracture, casting erratic patterns of light and shadow across the obsidian walls of her sanctuary. She saw it then, not as a clear image, but as a feeling, a terrifying premonition of a world teetering on the precipice. It was a disturbance in the weave, a snag in the tapestry of magic that held their realm together. "The balance, it falters," she breathed, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. The words were barely audible, yet they resonated with a power that shook the very foundations of the citadel. Her spirit, a timeless vortex of starlight, recoiled from the vision, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what it had glimpsed. It was not a mere shift, not a localized disruption, but a seismic event that promised to rewrite the fundamental laws of their existence. The king, a man accustomed to the weight of empires and the pronouncements of war, found himself unnerved by the raw, unbridled fear radiating from the ancient seer. He had come seeking reassurance, a glimpse of a favorable future, perhaps a strategy to counter the growing unease within his kingdom. Instead, he was confronted by a tempest of prophecy, a vision that spoke not of victory, but of chaos. "Lysandra, what is it you see?" King Theron asked, his voice attempting a calm it did not feel. He stepped closer, his hand instinctively reaching for the hilt of his sword, a gesture of defiance against an unseen enemy. The oracle turned her fractured gaze upon him, the starlight within her eyes flickering like dying embers. "A shadow," she whispered, the word drawn out, laced with the dread that seemed to seep into the very stone of the sanctum. "A shadow that walks not in darkness, but within the light. A walker of paths unknown, whose slumbering power stirs. It is a force contained, a tempest held at bay, but the dam is weakening, your majesty. The containment, it cracks." She raised a trembling hand, pointing a finger towards an unseen point in the distance. "I see a flicker, a spark in the void. A being who has known only stillness, a surface of placid emptiness, yet beneath lies a wellspring of unrestrained might. This might, unacknowledged, unformed, is about to awaken. It is a power that does not play by the established rules of magic, a force that can unravel." King Theron frowned, his brow furrowed with concern. "Unravel? What do you mean, Oracle? Unravel what?" Lysandra's breath hitched, a ragged gasp that echoed the fracturing of her inner light. "The weave. The very fabric of our world's magic. It is a delicate tapestry, woven with the threads of intention, of spirit, of life itself. This Shadow Walker, though unaware, possesses the potential to tear it asunder. Their suppressed might, when unleashed, will create a paradox, a disruption that will send ripples across all planes of existence." She closed her eyes for a moment, her form shuddering as she tried to parse the torrent of images and sensations. "I see a cart, a moment of desperate instinct, a force unseen that intervenes. It is a glimpse, a fleeting manifestation, but it is proof. The void, it is not empty. It is a reservoir, a hidden wellspring of something potent, something dangerous. And it is growing." "A cart?" King Theron repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "You speak of cosmic unraveling and a world-altering power, and you see it manifested in a runaway cart?" "The grandest of storms begin with a single gust of wind, your majesty," Lysandra replied, her voice gaining a fraction of its former strength. "The insignificant can herald the cataclysmic. This individual, this shadow walker, is an anomaly. They exist in a state of profound detachment, a void that has always shielded them. But this void is not a true emptiness. It is a deep reservoir, a hidden wellspring of power that they themselves do not understand, a power that has begun to stir in response to something. Perhaps an instinct, a desperate plea. And the world, the very essence of magic, responded. She paused, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the king's shoulder, her eyes seeming to pierce through the stone walls and into the realm of the unseen. This power is not born of the spirit companions that grace our mages, nor of the ancient pacts that bind our sorcerers. It is something primal. Something that exists outside the known currents of magic. It is a force that, if unchecked, could shatter the delicate balance that preserves our reality. And this individual, do you see who they are? Where they are? The king pressed, his impatience warring with a growing sense of unease. Lysandra shook her head slowly, the starlight within her dimming further. The vision is fragmented. They are a phantom, a ghost in their own life, with no memory of their past. They have learned to exist as an observer, to feel nothing, to remain unseen. This detachment, this carefully cultivated stillness, has been their shield. But now, that shield is cracking. The very act of their existence, their presence, has become a potential catalyst for imbalance. She shuddered, a profound tremor passing through her. I see the fear in them, Your Majesty. A primal fear of discovery, of dissection, of being categorized as a threat. They seek only to remain invisible, to return to their cherished solitude. But this power, this uncontrolled surge, is a beacon. It will draw attention, unwanted attention, from those who seek to understand and control the extraordinary. Who? Who seeks to control them? King Theron demanded, his voice sharp. Those who guard the order, Lysandra replied, her voice a low murmur. Those who perceive anomalies, who seek to understand and, if necessary, to contain or eradicate. Their very existence, though hidden, has been momentarily glimpsed by eyes that pierce the veil. The keen gaze of those who maintain the intricate balance of Ethelgard has, however fleetingly, perceived an anomaly. And that perception is a danger. The king's gaze sharpened. He understood the implication. The royal guard, with their specialized training and their innate sensitivities to magical disturbances, would be among the first to investigate any anomaly. And if this individual's power, however nascent, had been detected, it would not be ignored. They are afraid of being studied, of being probed. Lysandra continued, her voice growing weaker, as if each word drained her of vital essence. Their inner world, even in its perceived emptiness, is their last bastion. They will defend it with all their being. They will retreat, seek to bury this power deeper than ever, to ensure it never again ripples to the surface and draws the attention of those who would exploit or eradicate it. The thought of being truly known, of being understood, is anathema to them. Their isolation, once a chosen state, has become their fortress, their stillness their weapon. They will become a master of their own void, ensuring that the seeds of doubt, once sown, are never allowed to sprout into the full bloom of revelation. So, this individual is not seeking power, but actively trying to suppress it. King Theron mused aloud, piecing together the fragmented pronouncements. Indeed, Lysandra confirmed, her voice barely a whisper. They are a paradox. A void that is not empty, a stillness that is a coiled spring of immense potential. They fear this power, fear what it means for their carefully constructed existence, and most of all, fear discovery. They will strive to become an even greater ghost, a more profound absence, so that the eyes that glimpse their anomaly will find nothing but an unchanging stillness. They will render their extraordinary nature invisible, by any means necessary. A deep sigh escaped the oracle's lips, a sound laden with centuries of weariness. The first tremors have indeed shaken them. But in their fear, a new resolve has been forged. A chilling determination to remain forever in the shadows, an enigma even to themselves. They will become the ultimate void, a testament to the power of unfeeling observation, a living embodiment of the unseen. This is their new path, a journey undertaken in absolute solitude, leaving no trace, casting no shadow that can be interpreted. They will be the absence that is so profound, so complete, that it will confound even the keenest of eyes, even the most perceptive of spirits. King Theron was silent for a long moment, absorbing the weight of Lysandra's words. The implications were staggering. Ethelgard was built upon a foundation of controlled magic, of understanding and harnessing the forces that govern their world. The emergence of an uncontrolled, unknown power, especially one wielded by an individual actively seeking to conceal it, was a threat of the highest order. What must we do? He asked, his voice regaining its regal authority, the fear now tempered by grim determination. Lyssandra's eyes flickered open, the starlight within them rekindling, though with a subdued intensity. Watch. Observe. For now, direct intervention may be unwise. They are a creature of instinct, of fear. To confront them directly might be to push them further into the abyss, to force the unleashed power that they so desperately seek to contain. But know this, Your Majesty. Her voice deepened, resonating with a newfound gravity. The convergence is coming. The Shadow Walker, this untamed potential, is a linchpin in a destiny far grander and more perilous than we can currently comprehend. Their awakening is not merely a personal revelation, it is a herald of a coming imbalance that could reshape the very foundations of our world. The first tremors have been felt. The earth beneath Ethelgard is no longer as stable as we believed. The whispers have become a warning, and the warning, a dire prophecy of change. She sank back against her cushions, her strength seemingly depleted. The oracle's crypt is silent now, Your Majesty. The visions have receded, leaving only the echo of their foreboding. But the message remains. Ethelgard stands at a precipice, and the key to its future, or its unraveling, lies with this unknown entity, this Shadow Walker, who walks in the light yet carries the deepest of shadows within. The sanctum returned to its usual, albeit unnerving, quietude, the only sound the slow, steady beat of King Theron's own heart, a rhythm that seemed to falter with the weight of the oracle's cryptic warning. The fate of Ethelgard, it seemed, was no longer a matter of kings and armies, but of a solitary, unseen force and the terrifying power it held dormant within its own void.